I thought I had seen it all on the road, but that night on the Dalton Highway proved me wrong. My name's Marcus Tank Williams, and I've been hauling freight across this frozen wasteland for 23 years. From the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay to the supply depots in Fairbanks, I've driven every godforsaken mile of asphalt Alaska has to offer. The Dalton Highway, what we truckers call the Haul Road, is 414 miles of pure hell carved through wilderness that'll kill you without thinking twice. Polar bears, avalanches, ice storms that can flip an 80,000-pound rig like a toy. I thought I'd survived it all, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that February night when the temperature hit 47 below zero. Since that night, I only sleep 2 hours at a time, if I manage to sleep at all. I was 62 years old then, a grandfather of 4, with silver hair peeking out from under my worn Peterbilt cap, and hands scarred from 3 decades of gripping steering wheels in sub-zero cold. My wife Sarah had begged me to retire after my heart attack the previous summer, but the road was all I knew. It was in my blood like antifreeze in an engine, necessary, toxic, and impossible to drain out completely. The pay was good on the Haul Road, damn good, because most drivers wouldn't touch it. The isolation, the weather, the sheer distance from civilization, it breaks men, strong men. But I'd always been different. I thrived on the solitude, the challenge, the constant dance with death that comes with driving through the Arctic. That February run started like any other. I was hauling drilling equipment from Fairbanks to Deadhorse, a routine 500-mile journey that would take me 16 hours in good weather. But Alaska doesn't believe in good weather, especially not in February. The forecast called for clear skies and light winds, what passes for a blessing up there. But any trucker worth his salt knows that weather in Alaska changes faster than a junkie's mood. I left Fairbanks at 3 p.m., just as the weak winter sun was starting its pathetic descent toward the horizon. Up there, February daylight lasts maybe 6 hours if you're lucky, and the sun never climbs higher than a lazy man's ambition. The thermometer on my dash read -32 when I fired up Big Blue, my 2018 Peterbilt 389 with a custom sleeper that had been my home away from home for the past 7 years. The engine turned over with that reassuring rumble that had lulled me to sleep in truck stops from Anchorage to the Arctic Ocean. The first 100 miles were routine. The Dalton Highway stretched ahead like a gray ribbon threading through endless white wilderness. Snow-covered spruce trees lined both sides of the road, their branches bent low under the weight of accumulated snow that hadn't melted since October. The landscape was pristinely beautiful and utterly hostile, the kind of beauty that would kill you if you stopped to admire it too long. My CB radio crackled with the occasional transmission from other drivers, weather updates, road conditions, the standard trucker chatter that keeps you sane when the nearest human being might be 50 miles away. At mile 117, just past the Yukon River Bridge, I stopped at the Hotspot Cafe. Nothing more than a prefab building with a few gas pumps, but it was the last real civilization I'd see for hours. I topped off my tanks, grabbed a thermos of coffee that could strip paint, and used the restroom knowing it might be my last chance for proper facilities until Coldfoot. The attendant, an Inupiaq woman named Mary, who'd been working there for 15 years, warned me about a storm system moving in from the west. "Might want to chain up past Gobbler's Knob," she said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Radio says it's going to get nasty around midnight." I thanked her and climbed back into Big Blue's heated cab, grateful for the warmth that enveloped me like a mother's embrace. The engine purred as I pulled back onto the highway, and I settled into the rhythm that had sustained me for 2 decades. Watch the road, monitor the gauges, stay alert for wildlife, and keep the rubber side down. That's when I first noticed the other truck. It appeared in my mirrors around mile 140, just as I was climbing the long grade toward Finger Mountain. At first, it was just another set of headlights in the distance. Nothing unusual about that. Truckers often travel in informal convoys on the Haul Road. It's safer that way. If one truck breaks down or slides off into a ditch, the other can provide assistance or at least radio for help. In that environment, a breakdown wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. The truck behind me was maintaining a steady distance of maybe a quarter mile. I could make out that it was a dark-colored Kenworth, probably a T800 or T880, with a standard dry van trailer. Nothing remarkable about it, except for one detail that nagged at me. The driver wasn't running any identification lights on the trailer. Every commercial truck is required to have marker lights, but this one was running dark, except for the mandatory headlights and taillights. That struck me as odd, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe the driver had electrical problems, or maybe he was just lazy about maintenance. The temperature continued dropping as we climbed toward the Brooks Range. My external thermometer hit -40, then -43, then -47. At those temperatures, metal becomes brittle, rubber cracks like eggshells, and exposed skin freezes in minutes. The road surface was like polished marble, treacherous and unforgiving. I downshifted and reduced my speed, feeling Big Blue's tires search for grip on the ice-slicked asphalt. The dark Kenworth matched my speed reduction perfectly. By mile 175, just past Gobbler's Knob, I realized the truck had been behind me for over 2 hours without gaining or losing ground. In normal driving conditions, that might not mean anything. But on the haul road, trucks travel at different speeds depending on their loads, their driver's experience and their equipment. Some guys push hard and fast, trying to make time while the weather holds. Others take it slow and steady, especially when hauling hazardous materials or oversized loads. But this truck was matching my speed exactly, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance, like it was tethered to my bumper by an invisible chain. I tried to dismiss my growing unease as paranoia. After 23 years on the road, you develop a sixth sense about potential problems, but sometimes that sense can lead you astray. Maybe the driver behind me was just being cautious, following my lead, because he knew I was experienced on this route. Maybe he was new to the haul road and didn't want to risk losing sight of another truck in case the weather deteriorated. But as we descended toward the Koyukuk River, something else caught my attention. Every time I glanced in my mirrors, the headlights seemed to be positioned slightly differently. Not enough to indicate the truck was changing lanes. The Dalton Highway is mostly single lane in each direction through this section, but enough to suggest the driver was deliberately altering his position. Sometimes the lights appeared centered in my mirror. Sometimes they were offset to the left, sometimes to the right. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I reached for my CB radio and keyed the microphone. Breaker 19. This is Big Blue northbound at mile 190. Got a Kenworth about a quarter-mile behind me. You copy, driver? Static filled the cab. I tried again, using the standard trucker protocol. Kenworth running dark behind Big Blue, you got your ears on? Come back. Still nothing but the hiss of empty airwaves. Either the driver's radio wasn't working, or he wasn't interested in talking. In my experience, truckers who don't respond to CB calls usually fall into one of 3 categories: rookies who are too nervous to talk, foreign drivers who don't speak English well, or drivers who have something to hide. The storm Mary had warned me about began to materialize around mile 200. What started as light snow flurries quickly developed into a full-blown ground blizzard. The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the road surface and reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards. I slowed to 30 miles per hour, then 25, following the reflective guideposts that marked the road's edges. In these conditions, drifting off the pavement could mean sliding down an embankment, or worse, into one of the many small lakes that dot the region. The Kenworth slowed with me, maintaining that same precise distance. By now, my unease had transformed into genuine concern. In weather like this, most drivers would either close the gap to maintain visual contact with the lead vehicle or drop back further to avoid a collision if the lead vehicle suddenly stopped. But this guy was staying exactly where he'd been for the past 3 hours, as if he had some kind of sophisticated radar system measuring the distance between us. I tried the CB again. Any drivers northbound on the Dalton? I've got a Kenworth running behind me that won't respond to radio calls. Anybody know what's going on out here? This time I got a response, but not the kind I was hoping for. Big Blue, this is Iceman westbound at mile 230. Haven't seen any other trucks for the past hour. You sure you got company back there? A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. Iceman was driving the opposite direction, so he would have passed the Kenworth if it was legitimately making the run to Deadhorse. Unless Ticha, Iceman, when did you pass mile 190? I'm showing a truck behind me that's been there since around mile 140. Big Blue, I came through that area about 45 minutes ago. Road was empty except for a breakdown about 10 miles south of your position. Looked like a Kenworth on the shoulder, but I didn't stop. Figured he was waiting for road service. My blood turned to ice water. If Iceman had seen a broken-down Kenworth 45 minutes ago, and that truck was now running behind me, that meant either it had gotten back on the road remarkably quickly, or I didn't want to think about the alternatives. I pressed the accelerator slightly, bringing my speed up to 35 miles per hour despite the deteriorating conditions. The truck behind me immediately matched my speed increase. When I slowed back down to 30, it slowed down. When I briefly sped up to 40, it sped up. The headlights in my mirror were like two malevolent eyes, never blinking, never varying their intensity, always maintaining that exact same distance. The wind was howling now, rocking Big Blue with gusts that felt like giant hands trying to push me off the road. Snow was accumulating on my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and ice was forming on the glass despite the defroster running at maximum. The heater was struggling to keep the cab warm, and I could feel cold air seeping in around the door seals. At mile 225, just before the long descent toward Coldfoot, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing straight toward the only truck stop for hundreds of miles, I pulled into the small turnout that serves as a scenic overlook during the summer months. If the truck behind me was legitimately traveling to Deadhorse, he would continue past, and I could rejoin the highway behind him. If he pulled in after me, well, at least I'd know where I stood. I brought Big Blue to a stop and left the engine running, watching my mirrors with the intensity of a sniper waiting for a target. The wind was shaking the truck violently now, and horizontal snow was streaming past my windshield like tracer bullets in the darkness. My headlights illuminated maybe 20 feet into the swirling white chaos beyond. That was impenetrable. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 2 minutes. Then I saw them. Those same two headlights, approaching slowly through the storm. The Kenworth pulled into the turnout behind me, maintaining the same precise distance it had kept for the past 4 hours. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a caged animal trying to escape. Every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of driving was screaming danger. I reached for the CB microphone with hands that were suddenly slick with sweat despite the frigid temperature. Breaker emergency. Breaker emergency. Any drivers on the Dalton Highway? I've got a situation at mile 225. Truck following me has pulled in behind me and won't respond to radio calls. Request immediate assistance. The response came from an unexpected source. Big Blue, this is Alaska State Trooper Unit 47. So I copy your emergency call. What's your exact location and nature of the problem? Relief flooded through me. Trooper 47, I'm at the scenic turnout mile 225 northbound. I've had a dark Kenworth following me for over 4 hours. Driver won't respond to CB calls and has been matching my speed exactly. Just pulled in behind me when I stopped. Copy that, Big Blue. I'm currently at mile 180 southbound, about 30 minutes from your location. Can you describe the following vehicle in more detail? I squinted into my mirrors, trying to make out details through the blowing snow and the glare of the headlights. Dark-colored Kenworth, looks like a T800 series. Dry van trailer, no company markings visible. Running without marker lights on the trailer. Roger. Big Blue, I want you to stay in your vehicle and keep your doors locked. Do not approach the other vehicle under any circumstances. I'm en route with backup. The state trooper's words should have been reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. His tone suggested this wasn't just a case of road rage or aggressive driving. There was something in his voice, a controlled urgency that spoke of serious danger. I sat there in the cab, engine idling, watching those headlights in my mirror and trying to control my breathing. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and I was beginning to wonder if the trooper would be able to reach us at all. At these temperatures in this wind, even a minor mechanical problem could strand a vehicle for hours or days. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, I saw the headlights behind me begin to move. The Kenworth was backing up slowly, carefully until it reached the highway. Then it pulled forward and stopped, blocking the turnout exit. I was trapped. I keyed the CB microphone again, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Trooper 47, the subject vehicle has moved to block my exit. I'm trapped in the turnout. Copy that, Big Blue. I'm still 15 minutes out. Continue to stay in your vehicle. Do not attempt to ram through or confront the driver. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, I could freeze to death if something happened to my engine. In 15 minutes, whoever was in that Kenworth could do whatever they had planned for the past 4 hours. In 15 minutes, my wife Sarah could become a widow. The Kenworth's headlights suddenly went out, plunging the area behind me into darkness. The only light came from my own headlights, reflecting off the swirling snow and the faint green glow of my dashboard instruments. The silence was absolute, except for the howling wind and the steady rumble of Big Blue's engine. Then I heard it, the sound of a truck door slamming shut. Someone was out there in the storm, in temperatures that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. Someone who had followed me for over 200 miles, through some of the most desolate country in North America. Someone who had deliberately trapped me in this turnout, knowing that help was at least 15 minutes away. I reached under my seat and pulled out the .357 Magnum revolver I'd carried for the past 10 years. I'd never had to use it, but Alaska is a dangerous place, and not just because of the weather. There are predators out there, both animal and human, that view a lone trucker as an easy target. My hands were shaking as I checked the cylinder. 6 rounds, 6 chances to stay alive until the trooper arrived. Through the storm, I caught a glimpse of movement near the front of my truck. A dark figure, barely visible in the swirling snow, was moving along the driver's side. Whoever it was dressed in Arctic gear, a parka with a fur-lined hood that obscured their face, heavy boots, and what looked like military-style cold weather gear. This wasn't some stranded motorist or confused tourist. This was someone who had come prepared for exactly this situation. The figure stopped at my driver's door and raised a gloved hand to knock on the window. Even through the glass and the storm, I could see that the hand held something metallic, something that caught the reflection from my dashboard lights. A knife, a big one. I pressed the CB microphone button and whispered urgently, "Trooper 47, subject is outside my vehicle armed with a knife. How far out are you?" Big Blue. Maintain radio silence unless absolutely necessary. I'm 10 minutes out. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, this could all be over. In 10 minutes, my grandchildren could be visiting their grandfather's grave instead of listening to his road stories. In 10 minutes, Sarah could be making funeral arrangements instead of cooking the pot roast she'd promised to have ready when I got home. The figure knocked again, more insistently this time. When I didn't respond, they moved around to the passenger side of the truck. I swiveled in my seat, keeping the gun pointed toward whichever side they were on. The cab of a semi-truck has a lot of windows, and I was beginning to feel like a goldfish in a bowl. Through the passenger window, I saw a face for the first time. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with pale skin and eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear him over the wind and the sound of my engine. He gestured toward the door handle, making it clear he wanted me to let him in. I shook my head and held up the revolver so he could see it. His expression didn't change. If anything, he smiled. A cold, predatory expression that made my blood freeze even colder than it already was. He held up his own weapon, not just a knife, but what looked like a military-style combat blade with a serrated edge. Then he did something that nearly made my heart stop. He pulled out a small electronic device and pointed it at my truck. Suddenly, my engine began to sputter and cough. The dashboard lights flickered, and the heater fans slowed to a whisper. He had some kind of electronic jamming device, something that could interfere with my truck's computer systems. In temperatures like this, if my engine died, I'd have maybe 20 minutes before the cab temperature dropped to lethal levels. The fuel in my tank would gel, the oil would thicken to the consistency of molasses, and the battery would lose power rapidly. I had 2 choices: let him in and face whatever he had planned, or stay locked in the cab and hope the state trooper arrived before I froze to death. I chose a third option. I dropped Big Blue into gear and floored the accelerator, aiming directly at the Kenworth blocking my exit. The man outside my truck dove away into a snowbank as my 80,000-pound rig lurched forward like a charging elephant. The distance to the blocking truck was only about 30 yards, but in the blowing snow and on the ice-covered surface, it felt like 30 miles. The Kenworth's driver had anticipated this move. As I approached, the truck suddenly lurched forward, trying to complete the roadblock. But Big Blue had momentum and weight on my side. I struck the Kenworth's trailer at a slight angle, the impact sending a tremendous shudder through both vehicles. Metal screamed against metal, glass shattered, and both trucks slid sideways on the ice. But the roadblock was broken. I managed to squeeze past the damaged Kenworth and get back onto the highway, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. In my mirrors I could see the Kenworth trying to follow, but my impact had damaged something in its front end. It was moving slowly, irregularly, leaving a trail of what looked like antifreeze in the snow. I grabbed the CB microphone and shouted, "Trooper 47, I've broken free and I'm southbound on the highway. The subject vehicle is following but appears to be damaged. Big Blue, I can see your headlights. Continue toward my position. I have backup units en route." Never in my life had anything looked as beautiful as those flashing red and blue lights appearing through the storm ahead of me. I could see not just one patrol car, but two, positioned to block both lanes of the highway. As I approached, one of the troopers waved me to the shoulder and motioned for me to stop. I pulled Big Blue to a halt and sat there for a moment, my hands shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the past hour was wearing off, leaving me feeling weak and nauseous. Through my mirrors, I could see the damaged Kenworth approaching slowly, its headlights weaving slightly, as if the driver was having trouble controlling the vehicle. The state troopers were ready for him. As the Kenworth got within 100 yards of the roadblock, spotlights suddenly blazed to life, turning the swirling snow into a brilliant white wall. The truck stopped immediately, probably blinded by the intensity of the lights. What happened next was choreographed with military precision. 4 troopers approached the Kenworth from different angles, their weapons drawn, using their patrol cars as cover. I could hear their voices over the wind, shouting commands, but I couldn't make out the words. The truck's door opened, and the same man I'd seen outside my cab emerged with his hands raised. Even from a distance, I could see he was no longer carrying the knife. The troopers surrounded him quickly, and within minutes he was face down in the snow with his hands cuffed behind his back. A trooper approached my cab and knocked on the driver's window. I lowered it, and he introduced himself as Sergeant Mike Patterson, the officer I'd been talking to on the radio. "Mr. Williams, are you injured?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice to work properly. "We're going to need you to come back to Fairbanks with us to give a statement. Your truck appears to have some front-end damage, but it should be drivable. Are you okay to follow us back?" I nodded and managed to croak out, what was he planning to do? Sergeant Patterson's expression was grim. "We've been tracking this individual for 3 months. He's suspected in the disappearances of at least 4 long-haul truckers in Alaska and Western Canada. You're lucky you got away when you did." Disappearances. The word hit me like a physical blow. If I hadn't broken free from that turnout, if the state trooper hadn't been in the area, if I'd made any one of a dozen different decisions, I would have become another statistic, another missing trucker whose empty truck might be found months later in some remote ravine. The drive back to Fairbanks took 4 hours through the continuing storm. Every few minutes I found myself checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again. The front end of Big Blue was badly damaged. A crumpled bumper, broken headlight, and what felt like alignment problems. But the truck was still drivable. The state troopers escorted me all the way back to town, their flashing lights visible through the snow like guardian angels. At the trooper station in Fairbanks, I learned the full scope of what I'd escaped. The man they'd arrested was named Robert Dale Morrison. No relation to my middle name, thankfully. He was a former mechanic who had lost his job at a trucking company 2 years earlier and had apparently developed a pathological hatred for long-haul drivers. His method was to follow truckers on remote highways, force them into isolated areas, and then, well, the details were too disturbing to fully process. The electronic device he'd used to interfere with my engine was a commercially available diagnostic tool that had been modified to disrupt computer systems in modern trucks. He'd been using stolen vehicles. The Kenworth he was driving had been reported missing from a truck stop in Anchorage 2 weeks earlier. The trail of missing truckers stretched from Alaska to British Columbia, all of them drivers who had been traveling alone on remote highways. I gave my statement to the investigators, but even as I was talking, I could feel something fundamental changing inside me. The confidence that had sustained me through 2 decades on the road was evaporating like water on hot asphalt. Every detail of that night was burned into my memory. The precise distance he'd maintained, the way his headlights had seemed to watch me, the predatory smile when he'd shown me the knife. It took 3 days to get Big Blue repaired well enough to drive home. 3 days of sitting in a cheap Fairbanks motel room, jumping every time I heard a truck engine outside. 3 days of calling Sarah every few hours to make sure she was safe. as if Morrison somehow could have escaped custody and traveled 1,500 miles to threaten my family. When I finally made it home to Anchorage, Sarah took one look at me and knew something fundamental had changed. I'd lost 15 pounds during those 3 days, and my hair seemed to have gotten noticeably grayer, but the real changes weren't visible on the surface. I couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those headlights in my mirrors. Every truck that pulled up behind me at a red light made me check my doors to make sure they were locked. Every CB radio transmission from an unknown driver made my pulse race. After 2 weeks at home, I tried to go back to work. I made it exactly 37 miles before I had to pull over on the shoulder of the Glen Highway, my hands shaking too badly to grip the steering wheel. A Good Samaritan stopped to see if I needed help, and when he approached my driver's window, I nearly reached for the gun I no longer carried. That was the end of my career as a long-haul trucker. I sold Big Blue to a young driver from Texas who had dreams of making it big on the Alaskan highways. I didn't tell him why I was selling. I didn't mention that sometimes trucks follow you for reasons that have nothing to do with convoy safety or shared destinations. I just took his money and signed over the title, trying not to think about all the miles that Truck and I had traveled together through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country on earth. Sarah was relieved when I told her I was done with long-haul driving, but she was also worried about what retirement would do to me. The road had been my identity for so long that she feared I'd wither away without it. She was partly right. For months I felt like a pilot who'd been grounded, a sailor who'd been landlocked. The house felt like a prison, and every day stretched endlessly ahead without the rhythm of shifting gears and watching mile markers. But gradually, I found other ways to fill the time. I started volunteering at a local truck driving school, teaching new drivers about safety and road conditions. I began writing detailed reports for the Alaska State Troopers about dangerous areas and suspicious activities on remote highways. I even started a small blog for truckers, sharing safety tips and warning about the kinds of predators who hunt along America's loneliest roads. The nightmares continued for almost 2 years. Always the same scenario. Headlights in my mirrors that never varied their distance, never responded to radio calls, never revealed their intentions until it was too late to escape. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering, Sarah's hand on my shoulder trying to bring me back to reality. Slowly, very slowly, the dreams became less frequent. The hypervigilance that made me check every lock twice began to fade. The startle response that made me jump at unexpected sounds gradually diminished. But something had been permanently altered in my relationship with the road. I still drive, but only during daylight hours, only on well-traveled highways, only for distances that allow me to get home before dark. I never drive alone on remote roads, and I always tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I expect to return. My current vehicle is a pickup truck with GPS tracking, satellite communication, and more emergency equipment than most ambulances carry. The man who followed me for 4 hours through the Alaskan wilderness was eventually convicted on multiple charges related to the murders of 6 long-haul truckers. The evidence included personal belongings from the victims found in a storage unit he'd rented in Anchorage, along with detailed journals describing his methods and motivations. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But knowing that Robert Dale Morrison is behind bars doesn't erase the memory of that night. It doesn't eliminate the knowledge that there are other predators out there, hunting along the millions of miles of highway that crisscross this continent. It doesn't restore the sense of invulnerability that allowed me to drive alone through some of the most isolated places on Earth. The Alaska State Troopers asked me to testify at Morrison's trial, but I couldn't bring myself to face him again. Even the thought of being in the same room with those pale, reflecting eyes made my hands shake and my breathing become shallow. The prosecutor said my written statement would be sufficient, and Morrison was convicted without my direct testimony. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made that split-second decision to ram through his roadblock. Would I have joined the list of missing truckers whose families still wait for answers that will never come? Would Big Blue have been found months later, empty and abandoned in some remote ravine? Another unsolved mystery along America's most dangerous highways? I try not to think about those possibilities, but they surface in quiet moments when my guard is down. Late at night, when the house is silent and Sarah is sleeping peacefully beside me, I sometimes find myself reliving every detail of that February night. The way the storm seemed to materialize from nowhere, The precision with which Morrison matched my every speed change, the predatory smile when he showed me the knife. The physical scars from that night were minimal, some bruises from the collision, cuts on my hands from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. But the psychological scars run much deeper. They've changed how I see the world, how I assess risk, how I interact with strangers. The road that was once my sanctuary became a hunting ground, and I was the prey. I've met other truckers who've had similar experiences, though none quite as extreme as mine. There's an informal network of drivers who share information about suspicious vehicles, strange encounters, and areas to avoid. Most truckers are good people, hard-working, honest, looking out for each other. But there are predators who understand that the trucking industry provides perfect hunting grounds, isolated victims, remote locations, and a transient lifestyle that makes disappearances easy to cover up. The trucking companies don't like to talk about these dangers. It's bad for recruitment, bad for public relations, bad for the bottom line. They prefer to focus on mechanical safety, hours of service regulations, and drug testing. But they rarely address the human predators who view long-haul truckers as easy targets. Since that night, I've become something of an advocate for trucker safety awareness. I've written articles for trucking magazines, spoken at safety seminars, and worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better communication protocols for drivers in remote areas. It's not glamorous work, and it doesn't pay much, but it gives me a sense of purpose. Every few months I get a call from a trucker who's had a suspicious encounter on a lonely highway. They've heard about my experience through the informal network, and they want advice on how to handle similar situations. I always tell them the same things. Trust your instincts, maintain radio contact with other drivers, report suspicious behavior to authorities immediately, and never hesitate to take evasive action if you feel threatened. Some people think I overreacted that night on the Dalton Highway. They suggest that Morrison might have just been a confused driver who needed help, or someone whose truck had broken down and been repaired. They point out that I never actually saw him commit a violent act, that everything might have been an innocent misunderstanding. But I know what I experienced. I know the difference between a confused driver and a predator stalking his prey. I know that Morrison's following pattern was too precise, too deliberate to be coincidental, and I know that if I hadn't trusted my instincts and taken decisive action, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. The hardest part of that night wasn't the fear or the physical danger. It was the realization that evil can be patient, methodical, and utterly implacable. Morrison had followed me for over 200 miles, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He'd prepared for months, studying trucking routes, stealing vehicles, perfecting his techniques. He'd turned hunting human beings into a cold, calculated science. That level of premeditation is what haunts me most. It wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. It was murder planned and executed with the same precision that I once used to plot my routes and calculate my fuel stops. The banality of such calculated evil is perhaps more terrifying than any sudden random attack. I sometimes wonder about the other truckers who weren't as lucky as I was. What were their final moments like? Did they realize what was happening, or did they trust Morrison's apparent breakdown story until it was too late? Did they fight back, or were they overwhelmed by the surprise and the isolation? Their families will never have complete answers. Bodies were never found despite extensive searches. Morrison either disposed of them too well or simply refused to cooperate with investigators. Some families still hold out hope that their loved ones might be alive somewhere, though rational minds know better. The trucking industry has made some improvements since Morrison's conviction. Better communication systems, improved GPS tracking, enhanced emergency protocols. But the fundamental reality hasn't changed. Long-haul trucking remains a dangerous profession, and not just because of mechanical failures or weather conditions. There are still predators out there, hunting along America's highways. They've learned from Morrison's mistakes, become more sophisticated, more careful. The next one might not be caught as easily. The next victim might not be as lucky as I was. That's why I continue to tell this story despite the personal cost. Every time I recount the details of that February night, I relive the fear, the helplessness, the moment-by-moment terror of being stalked by something that viewed me as prey rather than as a human being. But if my experience can help other drivers recognize and avoid similar situations, then the retelling serves a purpose. I want every trucker to know that predators exist. that they're patient and methodical, and that they specifically target isolated drivers on remote highways. I want drivers to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, to maintain radio contact with other drivers and law enforcement, and to never hesitate to take evasive action when threatened. The Alaska Department of Transportation eventually installed additional emergency communication towers along the Dalton Highway, partly in response to Morrison's crimes. The state troopers increased their patrols of remote highways, though budget constraints limit how much coverage they can provide across such vast distances. These improvements help, but they can't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability that comes with driving alone through hundreds of miles of wilderness. I've learned to live with the knowledge that monsters exist, that they hunt with deliberate patience, and that they view other human beings as nothing more than prey to be stalked and killed. It's a hard truth, one that most people prefer not to think about. But ignorance isn't protection. It's just another vulnerability that predators can exploit. The nightmares still come sometimes, though less frequently now. I still check my mirrors obsessively when driving, still feel my pulse quicken when a truck pulls up behind me on a lonely road. Sarah says I'll probably never completely get over what happened that night, and she's probably right. Some experiences change you so fundamentally that you can never fully return to who you were before. But I've found ways to channel that change into something positive. The hypervigilance that once made simple driving trips feel like military operations now serves me well in my safety advocacy work. The intimate knowledge of fear that Morrison gave me helps me connect with other drivers who've had their own terrifying encounters on America's highways. 3 years after that night on the Dalton Highway, I received a letter from Morrison in prison. I never opened it. Sarah wanted to burn it immediately, but I turned it over to the state troopers in case it contained information relevant to other cases. They told me later that it was mostly rambling justifications for his actions, mixed with what appeared to be veiled threats. They recommended that I not read it, and I never have. I don't want to know what was going through his mind during those 4 hours he followed me through the Arctic darkness. I don't want to understand his motivations or his methods any better than I already do. Some knowledge isn't worth having, especially when it comes from the darkest corners of human nature. What I do want people to understand is that evil can be patient, methodical, and utterly without conscience. Morrison wasn't a raging psychopath who killed in fits of uncontrolled violence. He was a calculated predator who planned his attacks with the same attention to detail that a legitimate businessman might use to plan a marketing campaign. That level of cold calculation is what makes such predators so dangerous and so difficult to detect until it's too late. The Dalton Highway still calls to me sometimes. On clear days when the temperature is above freezing and Sarah is busy with her own projects, I find myself thinking about those endless miles of asphalt cutting through some of the most beautiful wilderness on Earth. I remember the satisfaction of completing a difficult run, the camaraderie of the CB radio, the sense of purpose that came with delivering essential supplies to remote communities. But I also remember those headlights in my mirrors, maintaining their precise distance through hours of Arctic darkness. I remember the predatory smile and the combat knife. I remember the electronic device that could have left me stranded to freeze to death in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The road giveth, and the road taketh away. It gave me a career, an identity, and some of the most spectacular scenery I've ever witnessed. But it also nearly took my life, and it permanently altered my sense of safety and trust in the world around me. I still love the idea of the open road, the freedom and independence that comes with long-haul trucking, but I can no longer ignore the predators who hunt along those same highways, viewing isolated drivers as nothing more than opportunities for violence. Morrison wasn't unique. He was just the one who got caught. There are others out there, refining their techniques, learning from his mistakes, waiting for their next opportunity. That's the reality every trucker faces, though most prefer not to think about it. Every time you pull out of a truck stop alone, heading into hundreds of miles of empty highway, you're potentially making yourself a target. Every time you help a stranded motorist or respond to a CB call for assistance, you're taking a calculated risk. Every time you drive through the night on a remote road, you're trusting that the headlights behind you belong to another legitimate driver, rather than someone who views you as prey. Most of the time, that trust is justified. The vast majority of people you encounter on the road are honest, decent human beings who would help you if you needed assistance. But it only takes one Robert Dale Morrison to destroy that trust forever, to turn every routine drive into a potential life-or-death situation. I've tried to maintain perspective about the statistical realities. The chances of encountering a predator like Morrison are infinitesimally small compared to the millions of miles driven safely by thousands of truckers every day. More drivers are injured in accidents involving deer or moose than are victimized by human predators. Bad weather, mechanical failures, and simple driver fatigue pose far greater risks than deliberate violence. But statistics provide cold comfort when you're the one being stalked through the Arctic darkness by someone who's turned murder into a methodical science. When you're trapped in a turnout with a combat knife tapping on your window, the mathematical probabilities become irrelevant. In that moment, you're not a statistic, you're prey, and your survival depends entirely on your ability to recognize the danger and respond effectively. The lessons I learned that night extend far beyond trucking safety. They apply to anyone who travels alone, especially in remote areas. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't dismiss persistent following as coincidence. Maintain communication with others whenever possible. Have an escape plan and be prepared to execute it without hesitation. Carry means of self-defense, but understand that your best weapon is often your brain rather than any physical tool. Most importantly, don't let fear paralyze you. Morrison didn't win that night because I refused to let him. I didn't allow his predatory behavior to trap me in that turnout waiting for death. I took action, even though it meant risking a collision that could have killed me just as surely as his knife. Sometimes survival requires calculated risks. Sometimes the safe choice is actually the most dangerous one. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts over your training, your gut feeling over official procedures, your desperate improvisation over careful planning. That night taught me that I was capable of more courage than I'd ever imagined, but also more fear than I'd ever experienced. It showed me that evil exists in forms more patient and methodical than I'd previously understood, but also that ordinary people can overcome extraordinary threats through quick thinking and decisive action. The scar tissue around those memories has toughened over the years, but it's never fully healed. I don't think it ever will. Some experiences are too fundamental, too life-altering to ever be completely processed and filed away. They become part of who you are, permanent alterations to your basic understanding of how the world works. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The vigilance that Morrison's stalking burned into my nervous system has served me well in other situations. The heightened awareness of potential threats has helped me avoid several dangerous situations over the years. The knowledge that I can function under extreme stress has given me confidence in facing other challenges. Evil leaves scars, but it also teaches lessons that can't be learned any other way. Morrison showed me depths of human depravity I'd never imagined, but he also revealed reserves of courage and resourcefulness I'd never needed to access. In trying to make me his victim, he inadvertently made me stronger, more aware, more capable of protecting myself and others. That may be the ultimate irony of that February night on the Dalton Highway. Morrison succeeded in terrorizing me, in stealing my peace of mind, in ending my career as a long-haul trucker, but he failed in his primary objective. He didn't kill me, and in surviving his attack, I became someone better equipped to help others avoid similar fates. The headlights that followed me for over 200 miles through the Arctic darkness were meant to herald my death. Instead, they illuminated truths about survival, about evil, and about the resilience of the human spirit that continue to guide my life years later. I escaped alive, but I left part of myself on that highway, the part that believed the world was essentially safe, that trusted in the basic goodness of strangers, that drove through the night without constantly checking the mirrors for predators stalking in the darkness. Maybe that's not entirely a loss. Maybe some innocence is too dangerous to keep. Maybe the world revealed itself more honestly that night than it ever had before, stripping away comfortable illusions to show me realities I needed to understand. The road taught me its final lesson that February night, that survival sometimes requires sacrificing who you were in order to become who you need to be. Morrison may have ended my career as a trucker, but he began my career as someone who helps others recognize and escape the predators that hunt along America's loneliest highways. That night never ended for me. Every road since feels like a trap waiting to close. But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps constant vigilance is the price of survival in a world where Robert Dale Morrison represents just one face of the evil that stalks the darkness, patient and methodical, waiting for the next isolated victim to follow into the wilderness. The only victory against such evil is to refuse to become its victim, to survive, to remember, and to help others recognize the danger signs before it's too late. That may not be the career I planned, but it's the one that night on the Dalton Highway chose for me. And every trucker who reads this story and checks his mirrors one more time, every driver who trusts her instincts when something feels wrong, every person who refuses to become prey for human predators, they're all part of Morrison's ultimate defeat. He wanted to create victims. Instead, he created survivors. The headlights in my mirrors that night were meant to be the last thing I ever saw. Instead, they became the first chapter of a different kind of life, one devoted to ensuring that other travelers recognize the warning signs before they become trapped in their own turnouts, with their own predators tapping knives against their windows. That night on the Dalton Highway taught me that some roads should never be traveled alone, but it also taught me that sometimes, when you have no choice but to face the darkness alone, you're capable of finding light in places you never expected. The monsters are real. They're patient. They're methodical. They're hunting right now along highways across America, but they can be stopped. They can be survived. They can be defeated. You just have to be willing to floor the accelerator when the moment comes, to ram through their roadblocks, to refuse to become another statistic on their list of victims who trusted too much and saw too late. The road is still out there, stretching endlessly through wilderness, both beautiful and terrible. The predators are still hunting along its length, but so are the survivors, watching the mirrors, sharing the warnings, keeping the lights on for each other through the darkness. Drive safe out there. Trust your instincts. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing behind you isn't the weather or the terrain. Sometimes it's another human being who's forgotten that you're human too.